Today we're going to be talking about how to use thick and thin paint and how that helps us in terms of creating more contrast in our painting between light and dark and also more depth in our painting.
Now in this lesson we want to talk about using thick and thin paint. And what we mean by that typically is keeping your darks thinner and your lights thicker. And it's a comparative thing. I can have my darks really thin, very transparent, no white at all, just using transparent colors, and then build up the lights very thick and opaque. And that contrast of thick and thin gives you more depth in your painting. It makes the shadows and darks recede, go back, and in this case you can see the darks here are really receding, going back into that little canyon, and these lights really pop out. Shadows here of the dark kind of going back, and these lights sticking out because they're hit by so much light. That's the effect of thin darks and thick lights, and it's pretty important. It gives the surface of the painting a lot more depth, a lot more character. And too often we do paintings where the shadows and the light areas are the same thickness or the same thinness, and it really flattens and deadens your painting. But this contrast of thick and thin can, again, like I talked about earlier, being very thin in the shadows, not much color, very, very thin, and the thicks being, or the lights being very thick. But it can also mean you can have thicker darks, but the lights have to be that much thicker yet. In other words, I still want that contrast. I still want thicker paint in the lights and thinner paint in the darks. It doesn't have to be a transparent dark, but the lights have to be thicker. They have to really stand out, at least 2 or 3 times thicker than the darks. So if I paint my darks thick, then I have to make my lights that much thicker. Some artists will scrape the shadows. They will put the shadows, like in the mountains back in here, fairly thick in here, so that the shadows have color to them. And then they'll take a palette knife and just scrape it, or flatten it anyway. And that works good on a toned canvas, so you're not, when you scrape the shadows, it doesn't go down all the way to a white canvas and make the shadows too light. So I tend to have a toned canvas when I do that. But we really want to focus on building up those lights. And the main thing here in this little talk about that will be, when we look at the reference, like everything else, we want to decide the focal point, where I'm going to crop it, and how to get rid of unnecessary stuff. So looking at this has a lot of what could be focal points. You could have something here in the foreground, there's a lot of contrast, a lot of nice shapes, or back in here can be the focal point. And whichever one I pick depends on how I'll crop it. If I want to really focus on the background mountains, I want to get rid of a lot of the foreground and a lot of the right side and keep a little bit more of the left side. And I could make it a longer horizontal. There's a lot of different ways, but this cuts down on just too much stuff. I mean, there's a lot of nice stuff in the whole photograph, but it's too much. And it's better to zoom in and make the focal point bigger, which I did here by zooming in. And that makes a pretty good composition. It has there what I liked, what made me take the photograph. But I just got rid of all the other stuff too. The foreground has some interest to it. If I want the foreground to be a little bit more part of the focal point, I could do maybe a square or a vertical. And I have a lot of stuff here in the foreground. I like both of these equal. I think they both make good paintings. The whole photograph is still just too big. It makes my, whatever focal point I pick, whether it's down here in the foreground or in the background, it makes those focal points too small and includes too much clutter on the sides and on the bottom. And frankly, too much sky too. And simplifying the shapes after composing is really going to make it easier to do the thicker and thinner paint. Because if we can simplify the shapes and then simplify the values, the color and the painting process becomes a lot easier. Same thing with this one. My focal point is going to be the cliffs. So I'm going to try more of a square here. Let's do a vertical. As you can see, you can spend time with all 3 shapes, a square, vertical, horizontal, or maybe even a long horizontal, which would be more of a fourth shape. But this gets to the heart of the matter. This is what makes it important. And I think the more you understand about composition and the importance of separating darks and lights, the more you're going to take references that have strong shadow patterns. And this one has that. And pretty obvious in the background is a cloud shadow making this dark, and a form shadow of the sun hitting these mountains, and then the shadow pattern in here. And I'd probably force a bit more of a shadow pattern there. So I have dark, light, dark, light, dark, light, dark. Really strong contrast shapes. And once you find that and isolate it in your reference on your thumbnail, then the painting becomes a lot easier. It's when you just take a photograph and just start copying. You're not considering the light, what direction it's coming from, the time of day, simplifying the shadow patterns, getting rid of stuff that isn't all that necessary. It clutters up the composition and makes the painting really hard. You might get a nice drawing from this. You know, we can get involved in the detail, all the detail in the trees, all the detail in the cliffs, the detail in here, and get that drawn on the canvas, but you're not going to go much further than that, because values become too hard because you have too many little shapes, and then color becomes impossible because there's too many little values to come up with any idea of color. So spend time on these, cropping, and when I photograph again, except for this one, I usually take a bigger, wider view knowing I'm going to crop. And this one's been cropped already. And again, a lot of shadows, a real strong shadow pattern back in here. And all these trees are part of a shadow pattern. And it really is pretty good composition. I like how that sets up. And has a good variety of dark and lights. And we'll keep the, again, darks thinner. And be very conscious of building up these lights. It's when we do that that the lights really look sunlit. I can get the right value here and the right temperature, and I can get the right value in the shadow and the right temperature and have, you know, nice dark, cool shadow and a light, warm, sunlit green. But if I don't have a contrast of thick and thin paint, or if I don't have the lights thick enough, they're not going to have any impact. Just no suggestion of sunlight. So with oil paint, it's that thicker paint that gives the suggestion of sunlight. With watercolor, it's the opposite. It's the white paper underneath that the light goes through the transparent colors and hits that white paper and really makes it glow. So when you have watercolors, transparent watercolors, it's the thinness that makes the lights look light. But that's for transparent painting in watercolor. In opaque painting and oil paint and acrylic, it's the thickness of the lights and the thinness of the darks that makes it look more sunlit. Now I mentioned watercolors, and this is a watercolor by Edward Ciego. He was a British painter early and mid-20th century. Worked primarily in oils, but he did a lot of outdoor sketching in watercolor. And you can see the shadows have a bit more pigment in them, and the lights are very thin. And when the lights are very thin, the light goes through the lights and hits that white paper and really creates a glow. Like this in here, that really pops because of the thinner color in the lights. Same thing in the street here. And the shadows, a bit more pigment. So it's the opposite in watercolor. You see the sunlit side of the church here has more of a glow to it. Of course, he's using a real thin yellow, ochre, or orange to show that. But the shadows have a bit more pigment and the lights are thinner. But when you use opaque paint, the opposite works. This is also Edward Ciego. This is an outdoor sketch. He didn't use a big variety of color. A lot of times when he painted outside, he used an indigo blue, which is black and blue in a tube. Winsor Newton is the only color I've seen it, or brand I've seen it in. But it's a blackish blue, and then he used yellow ochre and kind of an Indian red or an English red, and of course white. But you can see how thick the lights are here. You can count the brush strokes there and there, very thick, and that makes them pop out. That thickness, that opaqueness really makes it jump out against these thinner darks. Now the darks aren't transparent, there's white in them, but they're not nearly as opaque as the lights, and very thin. Thick enough that they have color, though. They're not so thin that they lose any sense of color. But it's that contrast of these thinner strokes as opposed to really loading up the brush and laying that in there. Thinking about that, I thought it made a good contrast of looking at the watercolors and how that works as opposed to the oil. And understanding both of them a little bit helps you think about it a bit more. This one also, a lot of darks, a lot of lights, but again, too big. And the more my focal point would probably be this dark shadows and sunlight on the barn right here. So I need to decide what shape, and I think a horizontal shape is better. So I'm going to get a little bit of sky, and I want that barn with the deep shadows just off center a little bit. Do these 3 or 4 times when you get the image. If you don't have Photoshop, there's gimp.com. It's a free download, and you just download it, then you can put photographs in it, and you can do this. But I still do most of it with Sketchbook. Just so get the Sketchbook, plan on doing 3 or 4 little thumbnails you spend 5 minutes on, where you first start with maybe a vertical shape and try and fit the composition in there, a square, a rectangle, and then a horizontal. But this gets rid of a lot of the stuff that wasn't necessary. And also looking at what isn't necessary. I like this big tree, but I don't like all the limbs on it, so I can get rid of some of the limbs. Maybe just have a few. It's just way too busy looking, so the more I can get rid of some of that, the better. And also get rid of some of these. Maybe have a trunk here or a trunk there, but I'd get rid of that. Maybe a little bit of a trunk showing there, but way too much overkill on those dead cottonwood trees. So that one works really well as a horizontal, but would also work as a vertical. In other words, I'm getting rid of a lot of the stuff on the right and left side now and having more foreground. Still, my focal point is the barn. So play around with the composition. The composition is always the most important part of the painting. So think through these things. Come up with a good composition, simplifying. This one also, make a good square, if not rectangle. Not a very good horizontal because there's not much going either side going out from the barns. You get a few inches from the barns and it gets kind of dead, just the same tree. So either a vertical or square, or a rectangle that's a little more square, but a horizontal would not work that well. While the focal point is the barns, what made me take the photograph is the wildflowers here, and I can make them whatever color I wanted, violet, red, orange, or white, and have the shape of this kind of flow a little bit better. Kind of leads the viewer's eye in more. But that makes a good one too. And the darks here there's a lot of darks in the trees, a lot of darks on the buildings, some darks in the grass, but there's a lot of light here. So the darks are smaller in this because the sun is behind me. But I want to create probably a bit more dark variation in the trees. In other words, I would create a bit more of a pattern, really emphasize the roof of the barn here. I don't have to go this dark, although I'd have a lot of this dark in there, but really increase the shape here of these darks. Kind of the same pattern I see, but just bigger. I want to create more, that light trunk showing there, and those light trunks. But I'm creating more pattern here, and I'm not creating more, I'm just making the pattern I see bigger. So these are the darks that I would thin down, keep very thin, and some of the darks on the house. Thin those down and really load up on the thickness of the florals and the rooftops, even the color on the sunlit barn. A lot of strong color and thick paint. So this is the last one. But do spend a lot of time cropping. Same thing with this one. This may be more of a rectangle. I just want to get rid of too much foreground and too much on either side. I got rid of a lot of the foreground, which made it kind of bottom heavy. So maybe I don't want to do that. Cut off some of the tree and get all the foreground in there. So my barn is now, might be a little too centered. I'd probably still move it up just a bit more. But find a focal point. And here my focal point, it's an area. It's not so much just one spot or object. But I do want to lose a lot of the stuff that kind of draws me. Now this one doesn't have too much. It just has clutter around it that's easily separated. But some of the other photographs, there's a lot of things to fall in love with, but you got to pick one and eliminate most of the others. And then work on building up those lights and keeping those darks thinner.